course, Craig, you are an industry leader who is being looked upon in terms of sharing your valuable knowledge. So, my first question to you is, how do you envision the role of VR in reshaping the educational landscape in the 21st century?
Uh, Thank you for having me. First of all, I appreciate the wonderful introduction, and I'm just thankful to be able to be on this show and share, as you said, my knowledge. You know, in regards to your question, I see this as two fronts. So, you know, if we look at this amazing tool, there's sort of two things that are happening, especially in the world of higher education. One is using VR as a tool to offer hybrid learning. So, you know, after the pandemic, we definitely have seen that video calls and Zoom calls just aren't a great conduit for teaching and learning. But that doesn't mean that distance education like this can't be conducted if given the right medium. And we've seen this using social VR platforms where it's a far superior way to meet people and conduct education. So in the future, I envision that more and more universities and colleges will start to see the importance and efficacy of maybe not always having their students come into a physical building. You know, we're seeing this in the States. There's a company called Victory XR, which is deploying and helping many universities create what they've dubbed the metaversity. And the metaversity is a digital twin of the university. And I think they're up to 20 metaversities now within the United States. And the notion of the metaversity is to have this ability for students not necessarily to have to drive in. So it's almost like a layer of accessibility. And then the second piece that I think is arguably even more important, and I see this happening more and more amongst K-12 and higher ed, is I see VR and hope to see it in the future as akin or analogous to a calculator. So right now in schools, kids will pull out their calculator when they need it. Same idea. I envision in 5 or so years that students will pull out their VR headset and they'll put it on for 10 or 20 minutes to experience a wonderful, fantastic, engaging piece to the lesson. So those are sort of two trends that I see VR continuing to push the boundaries on.
Fantastic. So, in your journey, could you share some specific examples of how VR has already impacted higher ed? And the second part of the question is that what transformation it brings to the learning experiences for the students?
Yeah, let's start with the first part of that question. So there again are many examples, a plethora, and I won't, you know, I won't spend hours, but again, some of the great examples happen under this whole theme that my talk will be, and that is there's sort of two ways we see VR being used. One as a tool to enhance your lesson design. And social VR platforms like Engage VR or Spatial, these are great hubs where we're seeing already in higher ed teachers using them to perform more engaging, interesting, hands-on teaching to the curriculum. One example is I also run a podcast called VR in Education, and it's got 100 and some episodes. And I think it was episode 90 something. I interviewed Gary Burnett, who was an engineer out of Nottingham University in the UK, and he uses engage VR, whereby he brings students in, and one of his lessons that he was teaching was about car design, and they were looking at dashboards as well as some other ergonomics around designing cars. And in his lesson, he still had the familiar PowerPoint slide, but then he transitioned immediately to these wonderful 3D models of cars, and the kids had to get inside the 3D model of the car. And so again, this is a fantastic use of what instructional designers would call context. So there's so much we know about learning. You know, you'll see tons of organizations and companies wanting to do research on the efficacy of virtual reality, but there's already a plethora of research on teaching and learning and what already works. And we already know that if you bring the learner into a contextually relevant situation or environment, the learning's stickier. Well, VR does that. You know, that's why field trips are still very common in education, is because the field trip, if designed well, you know, take them to a tropical rainforest to study the flora and fauna. That field trip is contextually relevant. Well, VR is a field trip machine. And so number two, we already know, and we don't necessarily, you know, have to spend too much money on research. We know that active learning, as opposed to sitting and just listening, active learning makes learning stickier. Okay.
Yeah.
So if you curate a VR experience where students have to manipulate and sort and organize and do stuff with 3D models, you are facilitating an active learning experience. And again, you know, I'll go back to Gary Burnett's, my example with Gary Burnett and the cars. The kids they had the ability to be able to change things on the dashboard. So, you know, what if we put the radio up here? Does the driver have less distraction if the radio in the car is located in a different spot? So they'll move that. The second piece to your question is there's also a place for amazing vendor curated VR experiences, and I've seen that. I know one of your podcasts you had Rob Terrio, and he talked about some of these. We need to be able to also build VR experiences that might be dangerous in the real world. It might be something that might be counterproductive in the real world. Let's do that in VR. And there's some amazing vendors that are doing that. They're making VR experiences. Schools are paying for them. And there's stuff that you really couldn't do in the real world. And so that's the other hat that a school needs to think about and curate, you know, things like there's a great experience. I can't remember the producer of it, but it's called Little Cities, where you have to design a city. So if you're teaching systems thinking, if you're an architectural student at a higher education, you know, how wonderful would it be to have to go into a VR experience like Little Cities and start designing the city? You got to put the roads in. You start to build some of the housing and infrastructure. And as you're doing that, you're embodied within that experience and you're able to walk down the road that you built. So, you know, those two things. One, we want to make sure that we, as teachers, have a tool that we can facilitate contextual active learning. Two, we want to curate and hire companies to build these fantastic experiences that you know you probably wouldn't build within your own building, dangerous, counterproductive, etc.
Absolutely. I think the examples are relevant. And do you think, talking about a very niche into the higher education, engineering, for instance, like in bringing concepts which are otherwise difficult to teach in core engineering branches, be it, you know, mechanical engineering, that like the example that you had said. So One is setting examples, but the other part to it is that explaining the concepts, explaining uh, the depth of a subject, a topic via VR. Uh, so, what is your take on that? Do you think it integrating or marrying into the curriculum with the universities, or how does it go about?
Yeah, I love your notion of examples because, again, if we look at the science behind learning, examples are key. And more importantly, what we call a worked example. So, to your point on engineering students, how do you, what are the pieces and parts to an engine, maybe an airplane engine, a jet engine? So step one, just having that 3D model within the virtual space and being able to take it apart. Okay, that's step one. But then right now, I think a lot of organizations, even in an anatomy, they stop at step one. And if you look at and read books on how we learn best, you need to go to step 2 and 3. So step two would be to have something go wrong with that airplane engine. So once they know how it all fits together and the pieces and parts, then they need to move to step two, which is, okay, here's an airplane engine, tell me what part's missing. It won't start up. The airplane engine will not fire up. It will not carry out combustion and start spinning. Why? What's wrong with this example now that we've sort of given them? And then, another one is simply just how would we improve it? And so that process, that thought process is key to making learning sticky.
Yeah, I think that's a very well said answer. Um, which brings me to the next question. And I think it's a very important question because since, again, VR is very new, Web3 as a space is very new. So, how do you see universities adopting it? Uh, so, the obstacles and challenges in terms of, the creating the overall ecosystem around VR in education, be it higher education, be it anywhere. The deployment of VR in itself is, is very new in the market. So, how do you think how people are navigating towards it?
I love the term ecosystem. I think that's fantastic. And unfortunately, if we use that term right now in higher ed, the ecosystem's slightly broken because there's too much emphasis still in higher ed in simply just dumping information and material. The lecture model is what we might call it, and convincing professors and teachers that the best way to engage our students is through a variety of different teaching methods and modalities is sort of the first step. We again, because I'm an instructional designer, I can't help but go back to all my readings and studies about how we learn. And it's okay to start with a lecture, but then a good teacher realizes that just delivering that lecture once isn't going to guarantee that your students are going to know it. Okay, we have to practice it for a bit. So the old traditional model would be deliver a lecture and then give them some sort of assignment, which is usually a worksheet or a practice test. And that traditional, boring paper and pencil model of practice has become outdated given the tools that we have. So what I propose is a way more progressive model. If we're delivering a unit, we might, again, it's okay. We might deliver the information via a lecture, but then we're going to follow up with, putting them in a virtual world. And in that virtual world, we might have contextually relevant environment. We're going to have 3D models, and they're going to practice what we delivered that lecture in, a social VR platform like Spatial or Engage or Mozilla Hubs. And then maybe the next lesson, we're going to get them to practice it in some sort of scenario or real life situation. So if we can start to convince college teachers, professors that this preferred model is the way to go, then we're gonna definitely see even greater adoption of the tool VR. We're seeing this in the United States and Canada. After COVID, the attendance rates on many colleges and universities has been abysmal. They're starting to become disenchanted about the model of higher ed. They're bored. Okay?
Hmm.
They don't want to just be talked at. They want to be actively thinking. They want to be curious. They want to be engaged.
Hmm.
There's a company out of the United States that runs a podcast, but also does a blog called EdSurge. EdSurge did a series of basically deep dive into this whole issue of lack of engagement in higher ed and what it's doing. They interviewed students, they talked to college professors to get to the root of the problem, which is the old model of stand and deliver just isn't working anymore. And attendance rates in many of the non-Ivy League schools are starting to go down, and so schools need to start to pivot, and the pivot should be a newer way to deliver the curriculum. And VR has a big role to play there to help these students not only learn the material better, but also help them feel more engaged in their learning process.
Interesting. So this brings me to a follow-up question to your answer. So one is getting students engaged into social VR processes wherein they go into the virtual environments and they interact with each other. The other part which I can think of is setting up VR labs in the college ecosystem, in wherein even the again my I am sort of joining the dots in terms of teaching the fundamental concepts through VR in education. So if what is your take, I would say, in setting up a VR lab in a certain university or college? And do you think, is it also a path a college can take, or your views around it also?
Because VR is still relatively new, I am a fan of having them start with a VR lab, and then eventually, I think ultimately, if we go back to your first question where I said, when will we have the calculator moment for VR? I think ultimately that would be your game plan, is set up the VR lab. And the reason I say start there is there's so many little nuances that I think you have to get right when people are new to VR. Like our VR lab, for example, we start out, it's very structured. There are chairs on the floor. Those chairs have stationary boundaries. Okay,
Okay.
not great big, not large room scale boundaries.
Hmm.
And there's 22 seats. There's a very routine, mechanized system that we put into place so that when the class comes to the VR lab, they sit down, we give them an orientation first so that they understand how the controllers work. They have to understand the ins and outs and little nuances of VR before you take them into a learning experience. Otherwise, their cognitive load or all the distractions that aren't part of the learning process can get in the way of the learning. But that'll change. I don't remember, but I'm sure maybe my dad or my grandpa probably remembers how difficult the calculator was when they first came out. and navigating that. And I think that's sort of what it's like right now. So you want to deal with all the little minute details. I see on many videos and platforms where they bring in headsets into a classroom and the kids are sitting wherever within the classroom. I think the problem with that is if you don't standardize the procedure of getting into VR, then you know the student could get nothing out of the learning experience because they spent 15 minutes just trying to navigate setting down the room scale boundary or the circular boundary, and where are they supposed to look. So standardize all that until VR is not something new to the student.
Agreed. I think fantastically put in terms of setting an example also for our viewers. Sure. So my next question to you is that there are universities that have deployed VR in education, at least have taken a move towards it. So in terms of do you have any insight on students who have taken some classes or some lessons in VR, their role and their performance in the industry when they join the industry has been sort of encouraged by the industry, probably in sort of helping them out in whatever learning that they had done or the concepts they had learned sort of was fruitful. So have you met any of the learners who have shared such experiences with you, or do you have an insight from the industry per se, wherein you have spoken to folks and you got to know that VR has sort of impacted and how amazing this technology is? Because I think the examples amplifying the voices of students who have learned through VR might help create the awareness that it needs at the moment. So do you want to share any of those?
Yeah, first I want to give you credit and kudos to your understanding of good measurement. So, we do an okay job of measuring what's happening maybe in the moment. So, if we think of educational assessment and measurement of the effectiveness of a tool, often we can do that in the moment. We might give them some sort of question within the VR experience to see whether they learned it or not. But a better measurement, which is what you're alluding to, has to do with the idea of once in learning and development, the ultimate goal, like you just said, the ultimate goal should be how are they doing in the real world. So if you're a university and you're an engineering faculty, you're getting those students ready for their job, which is, maybe airplane mechanic or jet engine mechanic. Yeah. So if you're doing a VR experience, then once they've followed that with VR as an aid or a tool throughout their learning experience, whether that's just 1 year or 2 years, then when they go to become an airplane mechanic, what's their experience like? Are they saying they're more confident? Are they saying that they didn't need as much apprenticeship? I agree wholeheartedly that these metrics should be part of a program. The problem, of course, is these longitudinal studies are hard to do because often you lose track of that student. And I don't have, unfortunately, any stories or vignettes that relate to it, but I do want to give you credit and kudos to understand that this is key to knowing whether the tool is effective in doing what it is, which is trying to enhance and improve learning. So unfortunately, no, I don't have. I ask that question on a lot of my podcasts as well, and often the answers I get are what I'm saying, and they're like, no, we haven't had time to measure that yet.
Sure, no worries. This brings me to the last question. if I don't have any follow-up questions to your answer. Sorry. So my last question is, with the invent of AI, um, what changes are you seeing in terms of, uh, making it a part of and integrating it with VR specifically, and of course across domains, be it in schools, higher ed, be it in corporates, etc. But AI is the talk of the town, and where do you see it blending in with VR?
Yeah, I see two things here. So first, AI is going to help democratize VR for professors, for teachers. So I'm already playing with a number of different tools. I'm not, I know a little coding, but I don't know Unity and Unreal Engine, which are the platforms to build really fantastic, highly interactive VR experiences. I haven't spent too much time for the average professor or teacher. Those two game design platforms that help make VR it's just too much for them. But with AI, I was playing with a program called Lloyd, and you can just type in a prompt, I want a couch, and
Hmm.
it'll create the 3D model of the couch. It'll let
Hmm.
you use sliders to adjust all sorts of things on the couch, like the color, the texture, the number of legs, and then it'll let you download that file as a GLB, and then I can put that into my Engage or some social VR platform as a key 3D model. You could still do this in Sketchfab, but this
Yes.
allows you way more control over what you want your 3D virtual world to look like. And giving teachers who aren't experts in 3D modeling or VR world design, giving them those AI tools where they could simply put a headset on and maybe even verbally speak, I want a couch over there. I want an airplane engine over there. This is where AI is going to democratize the VR world building so that a teacher, just a plain old teacher, can build a VR learning experience whereby, like I said, they lecture, but then they take students into a contextually relevant, hands-on learning experience. So when teachers are given that level of ownership and agency, they're going to want VR. Right now, they're a bit detached from it because they're relying heavily on vendors to do all this for them. And in the vendor pipeline, obviously, it takes many, many days. Whereas teachers, sometimes they're building their lesson the night before or a couple days before. So the vendor's out of the picture for them unless we can have AI do a lot of the grunt work for them. Then the second piece to the puzzle that I think AI is going to help us in the virtual reality world is as a virtual tutor. So we already seen this with Khan Academy, not in VR, but on a computer screen. Khan
Hmm.
Academy has a virtual tutor where you're working through in Khan Academy math problems, and you can ask Khan Amigo a question, and
Yeah.
it's smart enough not to give you the answer.
Hmm.
It's smart enough that it can help you towards the answer. I see the equivalent to that inside virtual reality, where you've got an avatar, it's run by some language model, and you're in there, maybe you're struggling with parts to an airplane engine, and you've got a virtual tutor right there that, again, the key here is it can give you a hint, or it can kind of help you and guide you and coach you, but it's not going to give you the answer.
Yes, surely. I think the virtual tutor part is something that I have also explored. So yeah, I think I am also accustomed to that part of the example that you had mentioned. But yes, the other example that you had cited is something that is new, and of course, I'll mostly try the app to just be handy which would come handy to all of us, might come to all of us. There are some questions that have been put on the chat box. I'll just take a couple of them because we're running short on time. So one question that I found interesting was, again, is on the measurement from the student's perspective. So are there any proven methods for assessing student learning with an XR environment? So have there been any proven examples of those wherein the learning outcomes have been measured in terms of, again, as I was saying, that I gave the example of probably an industry, but inside the environment or inside the XR course, towards the end of it, are there any analytics that have been put to just gauge what exactly a student has learned, their outcomes, etc., so that a feedback could be given, or they could sort of be better informed about what they're learning, how they're learning, so their learning progress is tracked?
All the research studies that I read and look at, the fundamental problem is two things. One, they don't give me any details on the experimental setup of the VR. And I've mentioned this before, unless you're meticulous about ensuring, that the learner is comfortable in the VR headset and they know how to use the controllers and the environment, the physical environment is set up and conducive. So I need to know that. Otherwise, again, if you think about it, like, what if the student has never ever been in VR before and we put them in VR and then we conduct this study? Or what if the student is an avid gamer who owns a VR headset at home? Again, cognitive load is so variable. And this is what we call extraneous cognitive load. This is the cognitive load that we want to get rid of and then put them in the learning experience. So until I see a study that sort of talks a lot about the fact that they've controlled all this ahead of time before they get into sort of the before and after. And then the other thing is this, long-term meta-analysis of several research studies will be great, but scaling a research study, especially in humanities and education, where if we see it work in one institution, we're like, you know what, it must work in ours. It's not that simple in education. Again, let's say we do a research study and I'm taught by, part of it is being taught by a professor. Well, is it the same professor for the control group as the experimental group? Because if it's not, then what if Professor A is really good at explaining the material and then putting them in VR after? Well, they may not have as big a gains because Professor A is really good at explaining that material. Whereas if the control group's got Professor B and Professor B is terrible at explaining, then they're going to probably likely get more gains. So until we get kind of a meta-analysis of several studies, it's hard for me to wrap my head around research in XR. So I guess the short answer is I continually read these studies, but some of them I sort of am skeptical because I don't know what the research methodology is in regards to how they're setting up the VR.
Understood. And justifiable answer, I would say. I think the other questions, I was going through the questions while you were answering. So I guess I have more or less covered all the questions during my chat. So one last question that I have is how beautifully you sort of design your LinkedIn creatives. So what is the idea behind it? I think you just known in the LinkedIn community, in the Twitter community, as person who just brings out beautiful visuals and breaking down it very nicely, the use cases of VR. So what from where does the inspiration comes from? It's my personal question.
What a what a beautiful comment. Thank you so much. Uh, I've been at this now for about 6 years, convincing, talking about, and more importantly, distilling down why I think this medium, which we see so many people, once they put a headset on, they're pretty much convinced. So my job with the LinkedIn like pictures and images is to basically tease out stuff that I already know has been proven. Like we talked about, we know that learning in an environment that's contextually relevant is far more effective than trying to teach in a classroom. So I take those things and I distill them down, and I always ask myself, can VR play a role in what we already know about teaching and learning and instructional design? And I marry those two. And for example, the one I just posted last week was actually a bride and a groom, and the groom was an adult learner. An adult learner is different than a child learner. There's a bunch of properties and characteristics that we already know we need to attend to for an adult learner. And then the bride is the VR. If we look at how we teach an adult learner and what VR can provide, it's a perfect marriage, because adult learners have so much background wisdom and knowledge compared to a child. So because of that, they want experiential learning. Well, VR is the ultimate experiential learning machine. An adult learner, comes in and they need it to be practical because they're so busy. They've got work, they've got children, they've got to cook. And so we want to make sure that we give them ownership and agency. So anyway, I basically am just trying to convince people that VR is an amazing tool, and they just haven't thought of some of these little things that connect it.
Sure. I think the answer sort of is beautifully encapsulated. One question that I got interesting is just now from one of our viewers. I'm sorry I'm exceeding it. So there are a couple of questions. One came from internal from our team, and one is from the external. So I'll take both of them. Do you see in the future VR can be self-learning tool, potentially substituting college and universities? What is your take on it?
We're always going to need a teacher. So one thing that AI will not be able to do that a good coach does is the affective domain. It's still hard for an AI model to read emotions. And we learners are emotional creatures. And so there will always have to be a facilitator, someone that can help, motivate you, someone that can help, guide your decision making. So yeah, the short answer, no, we're always going to need a facilitator and a coach.
Okay. And one last question. VR technology can be expensive. How can universities with limited resources justify investing in VR for educational purposes? And are there cost-effective approaches to implementation?
One thing I strongly discourage, and this is why some people really like me and some people I make waves. I'm not a fan of 3 degrees of freedom headsets. So 3 degrees of freedom headsets basically mean that you can't really use your hands, your head's on a stick. So, I don't mind 360 videos as part of a 6 DOF or 6 degree of freedom, but again, if you think of all the learning science that I've brought up in this talk, you need to have the learner highly active and with lots of agency. But virtual worlds, you can start on the computer. So you can have some learners just go on to a 3D virtual world on their computer. You can partner them up. You can have one headset and then 2 students who have a tablet where you're screening what they're doing, and they can work as a team, and then they can rotate. So these are two approaches to try and get your education much more engaging and active. Is one, start out with 3D virtual worlds just on the computer. Two, buy a few headsets, but then have kids work in teams where they have a tablet and they can see what the others are doing.
Fantastic. One question, I'm sorry. So closing thoughts on your vision for the ideal VR integrated higher education environment and the steps needed to achieve that vision.
I had a LinkedIn post and it blew up. It blew up means it had over 50,000 looks and several likes and lots of reposts. And the LinkedIn picture and post was basically a graveyard, and in the graveyard were old VR headsets sitting there sort of dying a slow death. And to make VR sustainable, it has to be two-pronged. One, and I talked about this before, your college and university professors have to understand how to teach and design VR experiences and integrate into their curriculum. You know, if they don't, if they're too detached and you're simply just using vendors, then the vendor model is good. Don't get me wrong. I'm all for vendors. I think they have tools and they can create experiences that we as teachers just can't. But a school will not sustain a VR program if they're just using vendor after vendor. It's too expensive. The amount of time to integrate into the curriculum is too slow. There's too many weeks difference. So you've got to focus in on the professor and the teacher, and have someone like me who knows how to put what we already know about teaching and learning. You know, when I sit down with a teacher, I'm often talking about stuff they know about. I use the term immersive worksheet. And an immersive worksheet, they're like, oh, I know what a worksheet is. So they're like, Craig, what's an immersive worksheet? And I say, an immersive worksheet is you taking what you might do as practice on a traditional paper and pencil worksheet and ramping it up where we bring them into a virtual world. I'll say to them, what are the practice exercises that you're doing on this worksheet? And they explain, and they'll say, what if we take them into a virtual world, but we tweak it a bit? You know, it's always baby steps. People don't like change. Professors, college teachers, they don't like change. So let's just make the change a little bit incremental, and let's use terms like immersive worksheet because they know what a worksheet is. So let's tell them we're going to go into a virtual world and we're going to do an immersive worksheet.
Fantastic. And with that, I don't want to bombard you with any further questions. Thank you so much for doing this early morning, Craig. I think your willingness to contribute towards VR is something that we look up to immensely. We follow you throughout your social channels, your podcasts. I am a personal fan. So thank you for agreeing to do this. Thank you for everyone who has joined in. I appreciate it wholeheartedly. I'll be coming up with further knowledge series with other esteemed guests in the coming weeks. So stay tuned. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.